the stuff to call, they get blood from somebody with AIDS,
yeah,
and then they shoot you with it.
Oh,
so
well, that seems bad.
That's a slow death.
Yeah.
An Eazy-E thing, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Star Tupac Shakur died last night after a brief life in a rough business. He was 25.
Two men reshaped the direction of hip-hop at a moment when the culture itself was evolving into something far bigger than music. And yet, neither of them lived long enough to see what that transformation would eventually become. Because within a span of just 1 year, both of them were gone, leaving behind not only influence and legacy, but also a set of questions that have never been fully answered. Eazy-E died in 1995 under circumstances that were officially explained as a rapid medical decline, while Tupac Shakur was killed in 1,996 inches, a shooting that was immediately framed as part of an ongoing cycle of street conflict. And although those two events appear completely unrelated on the surface, the deeper you look into the environment they were both operating in, the harder it becomes to treat them as isolated incidents rather than outcomes shaped by the same underlying pressures. To understand why their stories feel connected, you have to go back to the moment when hip-hop stopped being just a form of expression and started becoming a system that involved money, influence, and control on a level that very few people at the time fully understood. Because what was happening in the late 80s and early 90s in places like Los Angeles was not just the emergence of a new sound, but the creation of an entire structure that would eventually grow into a global industry. At the center of that early shift stood N.W.A, a group that didn't just change how hip-hop sounded.
So what about the bitch that got shot? F her. You think I care about a bitch? I ain't a sucker.
Right.
Songs
That's
titled...
not talking about women, though.
What is it talking
about? A lot
about?
of women, bitches. It's a difference.
But also forced people to pay attention to what was being said and who was saying it. And inside that group, the internal dynamics already revealed something important, which was that success in that environment was never just about talent, but about who understood the business behind it. Eazy-E was often described as the quiet one, but that description misses the point, because his real strength was not in how loudly he spoke, but in how clearly he understood the mechanics of the system he was part of, including contracts, ownership, and the flow of money. And while other artists were focused on visibility and recognition, he was paying attention to leverage, which is what allowed him to position himself not just as a performer, but as someone who could influence outcomes behind the scenes. At the same time, however, that system was already showing signs of instability, because not everyone involved was aligned in how they saw their role within it. And one of the earliest indicators of that tension was the departure of Ice Cube, who recognized early on that there were issues related to contracts and compensation, and instead of accepting those conditions, he chose to leave, which in retrospect becomes a key moment, because it demonstrates that even at the beginning, the structure around N.W.A was not as solid as it appeared from the outside. That instability continued to develop as Dr. Dre, another central figure in shaping the sound and identity of West Coast hip-hop, also moved away from the group and eventually aligned himself with Suge Knight, forming Death Row Records, which would quickly become one of the most powerful entities in the industry, not just because of its music, but because of the environment it operated within. Death Row represented something different from what came before, because it combined commercial success with a level of intensity and reputation that extended beyond traditional music business practices, incorporating elements of street credibility, influence, and in some cases, fear, which created a situation where the boundaries between entertainment, business, and real-world conflict became increasingly blurred. At the same time, on the opposite side of the country, a parallel structure was forming, centered around the Notorious B.I.G, whose rise represented not just another successful artist, but a different perspective within the same culture, supported by a separate network of industry power. And although the East Coast and West Coast divide is often simplified as a rivalry between artists, it was in reality a reflection of competing systems, each with its own interests, resources, and narratives. It is within this increasingly complex and competitive environment that Tupac's presence becomes especially significant, because unlike many of his peers, he did not operate strictly within the boundaries of one role, but instead moved between different forms of expression, combining music, acting, and public commentary in a way that made him both highly visible and difficult to categorize. And it is precisely that combination that made him influential in a way that extended beyond the typical reach of an artist. What made Tupac Shakur particularly impactful was not just his talent, but his willingness to articulate ideas and emotions that resonated deeply with audiences who felt overlooked or misunderstood. And in doing so, he created a connection that was not easily controlled.
year, and I'm a convict, and my homeboy just got off a murder case. So that tell you that it's pure talent, no hype. We don't got no all-American smiles. They don't even want to buy our record, but they gotta buy our record because we represent the street. So Death Row East is gonna be a personification of what we did on the West Side. We're gonna do it to the East Side, and we're gonna prove once and for all that all these people talking about an East Coast, West Coast war, they like the Judas was to Jesus. They only here to cause confusion. We here to bring money and to bring change. They here to cause confusion. All these weak rappers, Nas, all these suckers, they battling off of East and West like this is a game. This ain't no game.
Because it was based on authenticity rather than positioning, which is something that systems built on structure and predictability often struggle to manage. When you place Tupac and Eazy-E within the same broader context, what emerges is not a direct collaboration, but a convergence of influence, where one individual understood how the system operated from within, while the other was actively expressing how that system was experienced from the outside. And even without coordination, that combination introduces a form of pressure that is difficult to ignore. By the mid-90s, that pressure had reached a point where hip-hop could no longer be viewed simply as a cultural movement, but had to be recognized as a significant force within a larger social and economic framework. And at that level, attention begins to come not only from fans and industry participants, but also from institutions that are concerned with how influence spreads and how it affects broader dynamics. There is documented evidence that certain artists and groups attracted attention from law enforcement and other organizations due to their perceived connections to street culture and their impact on public perception. And while not every aspect of that attention is fully transparent, it confirms that the environment surrounding hip-hop at the time was more complex than it appeared on the surface. Within that environment, individuals like Eazy-E and Tupac were not operating in isolation, but were instead positioned at points where multiple forms of pressure intersected, including financial interests, industry competition, and social influence. And it is precisely at those intersections that outcomes tend to become less predictable. When Eazy-E became ill in 1995, the speed at which his condition progressed raised questions among those who were familiar with him, because the transition from being publicly active to being hospitalized and then passing away occurred within a relatively short period of time. And although the official explanation attributes this to complications related to HIV and AIDS, the rapid nature of the timeline led some people to question whether all aspects of the situation had been fully understood. These questions, over time, contributed to the development of various theories, including the suggestion that his illness may not have been entirely coincidental, but rather the result of deliberate action. And while there is no verified evidence to support that claim, the persistence of the theory reflects the broader context in which his death occurred, namely a highly competitive and often opaque environment where significant financial and strategic interests were at stake. Following his death, it is clear that the balance within the industry shifted as influence and control moved toward other entities, including Death Row Records, which continued to grow in prominence. And it is within this shifting landscape that Tupac's role became even more central, as his visibility and influence increased at a time when the structure around him was becoming more complex and, in some respects, more unstable. As Tupac's influence continued to expand, what became increasingly clear was that he was no longer just participating in the system that had elevated him, but was beginning to move in a direction that suggested independence, both creatively and strategically, which is a transition that often introduces friction, especially in environments where control over artists is closely tied to financial outcomes and long-term positioning within the industry. At that point in time, Tupac Shakur was deeply connected to Death Row Records, a label that had quickly established itself as one of the most dominant forces in hip-hop, largely due to its combination of strong artistic output and a reputation that extended beyond traditional business practices, which in turn created an atmosphere where success was accompanied by an undercurrent of tension that was not always visible to the public. This tension was not limited to external rivalries, such as the widely discussed East Coast versus West Coast divide, involving figures like the Notorious B.I.G, but also existed internally within the relationships that defined how the label operated, including the dynamic between artists and executives, and particularly the influence of Suge Knight, whose leadership style and connections contributed to an environment that could be both highly effective and highly volatile at the same time. Within this context, Tupac's trajectory appears increasingly complex because his public persona was evolving in parallel with his private decisions. And while he continued to release music and maintain a strong presence in media, there were also indications that he was thinking about the future in ways that extended beyond his current position, including the possibility of gaining greater control over his work and redefining his role within the industry. Such considerations are not unusual for artists at the peak of their careers, but in a system where contracts, alliances, and financial interests are tightly interwoven, even the perception of a shift can create uncertainty. And uncertainty, in environments that rely on stability and predictability, often leads to reactions that are not immediately visible, but can have significant consequences over time. The events of the 7th of September 1996 in Las Vegas must therefore be understood not only as an isolated incident, but as the culmination of multiple layers of tension that had been developing over time, including personal conflicts, public rivalries, and the broader context in which Tupac was operating, all of which contributed to a situation where a relatively small trigger could lead to a disproportionate outcome. Earlier that evening, an altercation occurred that has been widely documented, involving Tupac and individuals associated with rival groups. And while such confrontations were not uncommon in that environment, the timing and visibility of this particular incident added a level of intensity that would later be seen as significant in understanding the events that followed, because it created a direct and immediate connection between different forms of tension that had previously existed more separately. Later that night, as Tupac was traveling in a vehicle, the situation escalated in a way that was both rapid and decisive, as another car approached and gunfire was directed at him with a level of precision that suggests intent rather than randomness. And within a matter of seconds, the trajectory of not only his life, but also the narrative surrounding his influence was fundamentally altered. In the days that followed, there was a mixture of uncertainty and expectation.
You are a true capitalist. You don't seem like the kind of person that walks into a wall and says, the wall's here, I can't go through it. I think you make a door when you come to a wall. Can you talk to young black people, especially the ones who feel like somebody is holding them back?
Nobody holding nobody back. You gotta look at something. Oh, let me say it like this. I know people say don't curse, but I'm a fuck up. If Suge Knight do something, they know I'm a fuck up, so it ain't no big problem. Now, if a fuck up like me can do something and make it, anybody can make it. All through from school, from elementary to high school to college, people looked at me a certain way. You know, like, he gonna get in trouble, this gonna happen, that's gonna happen. And I feel that, and I felt that I changed my life around and made it work for being an entrepreneur. A lot of people try to put a color thing in it. You know, they be going like, well, they don't want me to make it because I'm black.
Right.
In the music business, it's prejudice, but it's not black and white. It's young and old. Because you know, the older people usually be the ones where say, oh, you got some groups, you want to be an entrepreneur? Give me all you got, give me your money, and I'll put your stuff out. I mean, I knew some of the people who they call themselves legends in the music business who've been the biggest disappointments in the world.
As updates on his condition were closely followed by the public, and while there were moments when it seemed possible that he might survive, the eventual outcome confirmed that the injuries he sustained were fatal, and his death was subsequently framed within the context of ongoing conflicts that had been associated with his public image. However, as with the death of Eazy-E, the official explanation, while plausible, did not fully resolve the questions that emerged, particularly those related to the broader environment in which the incident occurred, and the extent to which various factors may have contributed to the final outcome beyond the immediate circumstances of the shooting itself. One of the most persistent questions in situations like this concerns the concept of benefit, not in a simplistic sense, but in terms of how outcomes affect the distribution of influence and control within a system. Because when a central figure is removed, whether through natural causes or external events, the resulting shift creates opportunities that can be observed in the way power is reallocated. In Tupac's case, his death had the effect of transforming his existing body of work into a lasting legacy that continued to generate both cultural and financial value, while also altering the balance within the industry, as other figures and organizations adjusted to the absence of a voice that had previously played a significant role in shaping the direction of the conversation. When these dynamics are considered alongside the earlier death of Eazy-E, a pattern begins to emerge, not in the sense of a clearly defined plan, but as a sequence of events that share certain characteristics, including the timing of their occurrence, the positions of the individuals involved, and the impact that their absence had on the broader system. Eazy-E's role, as someone who had a deep understanding of the business aspects of hip-hop, placed him in a position where his knowledge could influence how decisions were made and how resources were distributed, while Tupac's role, as a highly visible and emotionally resonant figure, gave him the ability to shape public perception in ways that extended beyond the immediate scope of his music, and the removal of both of these influences within a relatively short period of time resulted in a significant recalibration of the environment they had been part of. It is important to emphasize that recognizing a pattern does not inflation itself constitute evidence of intentional coordination, because complex systems often produce outcomes that appear connected even when they arise from independent factors. But at the same time, the recurrence of similar elements invites further examination, particularly when those elements involve individuals who occupy critical positions within that system. In analyzing these events, it becomes useful to consider not only the specific details of each case, but also the structural characteristics of the environment in which they occurred, including the ways in which power is maintained, how influence is managed, and how disruptions are addressed, because these factors provide context that can help explain why certain outcomes may be more likely than others. For example, in an environment where financial interests are closely tied to individual performers, any change in the status of those performers has immediate implications for revenue streams, contractual obligations.
Suge was gonna kill Dre. He was gonna kill him because Tupac was making #1 records, and Dre wasn't producing none of them. And Pac is getting ready to be done. So you get him out, got a 5-album deal, his first CD.
And strategic planning. And as a result, there is an inherent incentive to maintain stability, which can manifest in a variety of ways, some of which are visible and others that are not. Similarly, in an environment where public perception plays a critical role, the presence of highly influential figures who communicate in ways that are difficult to predict or control can introduce a level of uncertainty that may be perceived as a risk, particularly if their messaging extends beyond entertainment and begins to intersect with broader social or political themes. When these considerations are combined, what emerges is a picture of a system that is constantly balancing competing priorities, including growth, control, and adaptation. And within such a system, individuals who push beyond established boundaries may find themselves operating in conditions that are inherently unstable. This instability does not necessarily imply the existence of deliberate intervention, but it does suggest that outcomes are shaped by a complex interplay of factors, rather than by simple cause and effect relationships. And it is within this complexity that the stories of Eazy-E and Tupac take on a different significance, not as isolated incidents, but as events that reflect the dynamics of a larger structure. As time passes, the lack of definitive answers in both cases continues to contribute to a sense of incompleteness, because while certain aspects have been explained, others remain open to interpretation. And it is this combination of partial clarity and persistent ambiguity that allows different narratives to coexist, each emphasizing different elements of the same underlying events. For some, the official explanations are sufficient, providing a framework that accounts for the available evidence without requiring additional assumptions, while for others, the unanswered questions are significant enough to warrant alternative interpretations, particularly when those questions align with broader observations about how power and influence operate in similar contexts. What remains consistent across all perspectives is the recognition that both Eazy-E and Tupac occupied positions that were not easily replicated, and that their absence created changes that extended beyond their individual careers, affecting the direction of the culture they had helped to shape, as well as the structure of the industry that had grown around it. In this sense, their stories are not only about what happened to them, but also about what happens within systems when key figures are removed, whether by chance or by circumstance, and how those systems respond in ways that preserve their overall function, even as individual components are replaced or reconfigured. And it is precisely this broader perspective that continues to draw attention to their stories, because it shifts the focus away from isolated details and toward the relationships between events, encouraging a way of thinking that considers not just what is known, but also what remains uncertain, and how those uncertainties fit within the larger patterns that define the environment in which they occurred. When you step back and look at everything together, what becomes increasingly difficult to ignore is not just the sequence of events, but the way in which those events align with moments of transition. Because both Eazy-E and Tupac reached points in their careers where they were moving beyond the roles that had initially defined them, and in doing so, they were entering a space where influence becomes harder to contain and outcomes become less predictable. Eazy-E was no longer just associated with a group or a particular sound, but had positioned himself in a way that allowed him to understand and potentially reshape how the business side of hip-hop operated. And that level of awareness is significant because it shifts an individual from being a participant within a system to someone who can influence the system itself, which in turn changes how that individual is perceived by others who are also operating within that environment. At the same time, Tupac Shakur was evolving in a different but equally impactful direction, as his public presence became more expansive and his messaging more direct, resulting in a form of influence that extended beyond entertainment and into areas that are more difficult to quantify, such as perception, identity, and collective emotion, all of which contribute to a type of power that is less structured but no less significant. When these two trajectories are viewed side by side, what emerges is not a direct connection between the individuals themselves, but a shared position within a broader system that was undergoing rapid change. And it is within this shared position that the similarities between their stories begin to take on greater meaning, because it suggests that the conditions surrounding them may have played a role in shaping the outcomes.
I'm a Gemini. Me being a Gemini, I am the classic case of a Gemini. You know what I mean?
No, what does that mean?
It means that I'm quiet. I could be calm, quiet, and very into my work, and totally focused and totally disciplined, and boring. You know what I mean? Or I could be fun, but dangerous. Not only to other people, but to myself. Because I'm like a kid in a candy store. All of this is new. I'm 25, you know what I mean? And it's like, got cash, everything you dreamed of, and they've held me back in so many other circumstances that now it's your time to go, and it's kind of hard, difficult to keep yourself from just pressing the gas down all the way.
Even if those outcomes appear different on the surface, it is also important to consider the role of timing, because both events occurred at points where the industry was consolidating its structure and redefining its boundaries. And in such periods of transition, there is often a heightened sensitivity to disruption, particularly when that disruption has the potential to alter existing power dynamics or introduce new variables that are difficult to control. From this perspective, the deaths of Eazy-E and Tupac can be understood not only as individual tragedies, but also as moments that reflect the interaction between personal trajectories and systemic forces, where the intersection of ambition, influence, and environment creates conditions in which outcomes are shaped by more than just immediate circumstances. This does not imply that there was a single, unified cause behind both events, but rather that they occurred within a context that was already characterized by complexity, competition, and pressure, and that these factors, taken together, contributed to a situation in which stability was difficult to maintain, and where small changes could lead to significant consequences. The question of intent, which often arises in discussions of these events, is particularly challenging to address, because it requires distinguishing between correlation and causation, and between patterns that emerge naturally within complex systems and those that result from deliberate action, and in the absence of definitive evidence. It is not possible to conclusively determine which interpretation is correct. However, what can be observed is that both Eazy-E and Tupac were operating at levels of influence that placed them in positions where their actions had implications beyond their immediate circles, affecting not only their own careers, but also the broader dynamics of the industry. And it is this level of influence that makes their stories particularly significant, because it highlights the ways in which individual trajectories can intersect with larger systems in ways that are not always predictable or fully understood. Another factor that contributes to the ongoing interest in their stories is the role of narrative, because the way in which events are framed and interpreted can influence how they are remembered. And in both cases, the narratives that have developed over time include elements that extend beyond the official accounts, incorporating questions, theories, and alternative perspectives that reflect the complexity of the underlying circumstances. These narratives are shaped not only by the details of the events themselves, but also by the broader cultural and historical context in which they occurred, including the evolution of hip-hop as a global phenomenon and the ways in which it has been integrated into various aspects of society, from entertainment and business to identity and social commentary. In this context, the stories of Eazy-E and Tupac serve as reference points for understanding how influence operates within a system that is constantly evolving, and how the interaction between individuals and that system can produce outcomes that are both impactful and difficult to fully explain. As time passes, the distinction between fact and interpretation can become less clear. As new information emerges, existing information is re-examined, and different perspectives are brought to bear on the same set of events. And while this process can lead to a more nuanced understanding, it can also contribute to a sense of ambiguity, as multiple explanations coexist without a definitive resolution. This ambiguity, rather than diminishing interest, often enhances it, because it allows for continued exploration and discussion. And it is this ongoing engagement that keeps the stories of Eazy-E and Tupac relevant, not only as historical events, but as subjects of analysis and reflection that continue to resonate with new generations. Ultimately, what remains most significant is not necessarily the ability to provide a single.
What's up, y'all? This is N.W.A from Hot 97. How y'all doing, all right? Yo, chill out. Yo, hold on. This is my nigga Nas, and we both got one thing in common. We both represent Queens to the fullest. All right? Now, this brother was good enough to stop his show in the middle of the show, and I want everybody in here, everybody stand up on their feet first and foremost, please. No, don't make no noise. Every brother in here, please take your hat off. At 7:03 p.m. New York time, 4:03 p.m. Las Vegas time, Tupac Shakur passed away, y'all. Give me a moment of silence. Now, everybody out there that listen to Hot 97 probably heard about some beef Tupac got with Nas or whatever, with Mobb Deep, whatever. It takes a big motherfucker to stop the Miller hit. Okay? So we can recognize a brother that was part of the hip-hop culture that passed away. I don't give a what Tupac ever said on the record, no matter what, he didn't deserve to die that way. When the fuck are we gonna stop this bull and start loving one another? Don't believe the hype. It wasn't no East Coast, West Coast bullshit. It was some internal LA that took this brother out. Can we have a moment of silence for the memory of one of the greatest rappers that will ever live, Tupac Shakur?
Conclusive explanation for what happened, but the recognition that their stories illustrate the ways in which individual lives can intersect with larger systems in ways that produce outcomes that are both meaningful and complex, and that understanding those outcomes requires an appreciation of the multiple factors that contribute to them. In this sense, the question is not simply whether their deaths were coincidental or connected, but how their experiences reflect the dynamics of the environment in which they operated, and what those dynamics reveal about the relationship between influence, control, and change within a system that continues to evolve. And perhaps that is why their stories continue to be revisited, because they do not offer simple answers, but instead invite a deeper consideration of how events unfold within complex systems, and how the interplay between individual actions and systemic forces can shape outcomes in ways that are not immediately apparent. Because when you look at everything as a whole, what stands out is not just what happened, but the context in which it happened, and the realization that in environments where multiple forms of pressure exist simultaneously, the line between coincidence and consequence is not always clearly defined. And it is within that space, between what is known and what remains uncertain, that the stories of Eazy-E and Tupac continue to exist, not as closed chapters, but as ongoing questions that reflect the complexity of the world they were part of and the influence they left behind. And maybe the truth will never be fully clear, because some stories aren't meant to be explained completely. They're meant to be questioned, revisited, and looked at from different angles over time. And if you made it this far, you probably feel the same way, like something about all of this just doesn't sit right. So if you see it differently, or if there's something you think connects these pieces in a way most people miss, drop your thoughts in the comments. Because the more perspectives we put together, the closer we get to understanding what really happened. And if you want more stories like this that go deeper than the surface, make sure you subscribe and stay locked in, because there's always more beneath what we're told.